Hello and welcome to Ground Truth. Today we're going to be talking about fragility functions. This is the science behind how Safehub is able to send you damage assessments for your specific buildings after an earthquake. My name is Sarah and I lead customer success here at Safehub, and I am joined by Sean.
Hi, I'm Sean. I'm the Technical Solutions Manager at Safehub. And a bit of background from me, I'm a civil engineer and I have a master's in civil engineering where my research focused primarily on fragility functions, which is what we're talking about today. And then professionally, I'm licensed in civil engineering with experience both at the U.S. Geological Survey and the Federal Emergency Management Agency's earthquake program.
So we are ready to get into it. Let's set the scene. What is a fragility function and when does it come into play?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. So at its core, a fragility function is really a mathematical or visual representation of how a building is going to be affected by increasing levels of earthquake shaking. And so the horizontal axis is the shaking intensity, whereas the vertical axis is the probability of damage.
So when I'm looking at this graph, how do I understand or put into perspective shaking intensity?
Yeah, so the units we use are G. And just like in movies with cars and roller coasters, it's a reference back to acceleration that we experience here on Earth due to gravity. And so 1G is just what we feel on Earth's surface. So if you jump up and down, you're feeling 1G pulling you back down. And so typically in an earthquake, you'll feel higher accelerations or levels of G as you get closer to a fault. And then that really reduces as you get further away.
So as shaking intensifies, damage probability goes up?
Yeah, exactly. And the fragility curve is S-shaped. And so it accounts for the fact that, just like you assume, that probability of damage goes up as the shaking increases. And what's cool about these curves is that each building will have its own fragility curve that's tied back to its strength. And so the curves that are further to the left on the axis, you'd see those would be for weaker buildings that are more likely to be damaged at even low levels of shaking, whereas if a curve is further to the right, it's more resistant to damage. And so a good example would be an older brick building, maybe made 100 years ago, that didn't have any reinforcement or earthquake design. It would have a fragility curve much further to the left, whereas a more modern steel building designed by earthquake engineers, that curve would be much further to the right because it's stronger and more resistant to earthquake shaking.
Okay, that makes sense. So weaker buildings are to the left while stronger ones are to the right. But can you tell me a little bit more about the steepness of the curves?
Yeah, that's really what gives it that S shape. And so the steepness is related to the flexibility or we call it ductility in engineering of a building. And so more flexible buildings would have a flatter fragility curve. And so you think about bending a paper clip, it usually happens really gradually. And even as it bends, it still has some strength as you're bending it. And so that fragility curve would go up really gradually. So it'd be a much flatter curve. And then you think about bending a piece of chalk. So really you grab it and you try to bend it and there's really no bending. And then after just a little while, it just snaps. And so it goes from almost no damage to complete damage within this really narrow band of intensity. And so that would be a much steeper fragility curve.
Okay, so that's a really good visual image, but why does it exactly matter for fragility curves?
Yeah, good question. So buildings are designed for earthquake shaking. They by default have some fragility built in. And the way engineering works is that we're designing it such that a building can take a lot of damage before it collapses. And so that makes sense, right? You know, even if the building is damaged, we still don't want people inside to die. And so the building is designed to survive, even so as it bends, it doesn't break. But then you compare that with an older brick building, which is really quite brittle. And so it can hang in there for a little bit of shaking, but then you don't really get signs of flexibility. It really goes from no damage to complete damage really quite quickly. And once that damage starts, it ramps up really fast. And so in terms of fragility curves, that newer building would have a much flatter curve because it can flex, whereas the older building would have a much steeper curve because it just breaks.
So to clarify, two buildings can experience the same earthquake but have very different levels of damage or expected damage according to their curve.
Yeah, sorry, you've hit it on the head. That's really the critical point. So there, you can get alerts that say an earthquake happened near your building, but that really doesn't tell you the whole picture. And so really, you need the shaking level at the building itself, plus the fragility function to really know if there's going to be damage.
All right, so we're using the fragility functions to calculate damage. Is there a standard we are using, or did Safehub just make it up?
Yeah, thankfully, Sarah, we didn't have to make it up. There's some really good industry standard models that we've referenced without having to reinvent the wheel. And these are based on decades of engineering research. And the two main ones we leverage are FEMA's hazardous risk modeling software and the global earthquake model. And what's really cool about these models is that they're not just based on ideas. They're based on field observations of earthquake damage over the years, as well as lab testing and computer simulated modeling.
That sounds great. Glad there is a long history. So we have all of this history, but how does a specific building get assigned a fragility function?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so there's two main bits of info we need. First is, what kind of building is it? And then what is the code level? And the way you figure that out is figure out what kind of structure it is. You look at the building type. So is it concrete? Is it wood? Or like we talked about before, is it steel or brick? Then we think about what is the use of the building? Is it a school, a factory, a warehouse? And then how tall is it? Because different heights of buildings respond differently to shaking. And then so if we know what it's made of, how big it is, and what you use it for, it tells us a lot about the structure type itself. And then the second part is how well was it made? And the two ways to figure that out first are, where was it made? So was it made in a place that had a lot of earthquakes, where they designed well for earthquakes, or is it made somewhere that doesn't have a lot of earthquake history? And then when was it made? As we talked about, more modern buildings are more robust for earthquake design. And so you combine those two, that code level we just talked about, and the structure type, you put those together, and that gives us what we need to assign the fragility function.
All right, this all sounds great on paper. It's very theoretical, but how does this affect our clients when there is an actual earthquake?
Yeah, let's bring it back to the clients. And so if your asset has an appropriately assigned fragility function, and you know the shaking that happened at that building, then you get a really accurate representation of the likelihood of damage at that specific asset. And that's really what our alerts are based upon. So that's why right up front, when you onboard at Safehub, we ask you, where are your buildings? When were they made? How tall are they? And what are they used for? And that can really tell us a lot about assigning fragility functions.
So what happens if a client doesn't have all of this on hand?
Yeah, if they don't, that's really where we can help. So we have a team of in-house structural engineers that can help fill in these gaps. And we have a good understanding of the regional construction practices and earthquake design and different code levels, as well as hazard levels around the world.
All right, so we have all this information. Now, how do I go about learning how to build one of these fragility functions myself? Is there a tutorial somewhere?
Well, Sarah, thankfully, I can save you some time. This is exactly the kind of work that specialized training in structural engineering and earthquake engineering, that we use that to do this responsibly. And so why our team has those engineers on staff. And so because our team has the background, the academic training, as well as the career experience out in the field to really apply this information. And so our goal here is to make sure that our clients don't need that expertise in-house, because we've already baked it into our platform and our service here.
All right, well, I will leave it to you because I'm not going back to school to learn how to do this. So on a related note, some of our clients work with very sophisticated engineering partners and have developed custom fragility functions for their buildings. Can those be used on our platform?
Sure. I mean, that's really the gold standard. If they have well-informed fragility functions they bring to us, that's great. We can input those directly.
All right, so tying it all together, in the aftermath of an earthquake, why does this matter?
Yeah, that's really the crux of it, is that having this info loaded ahead of time, not minutes, hours after an earthquake, but before the earthquake even hits, having that info ahead of time really accelerates our clients' recovery. Because if you can combine that asset-specific fragility information and the exact shaking from our sensors, you bring those together, that's Safehub's cutting-edge situational awareness that we give our clients, so they know exactly what happened right after an earthquake.
So the sensors tell you how hard your building shook, and the fragility functions tells you what it means for your building.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. So that's the combination that sets us apart at Safehub. instead of just telling you an earthquake happened nearby, we can tell you what happened at your exact asset. And not just that it shook, we can tell you how much it shook. And then because we have fragility information, we can tell you what that means in terms of actual damage likelihood at your asset.
I love that framing. Thank you so much for coming on and explaining the science to us. So if anybody has any questions on fragility functions, please reach out to us. And yeah, well, thank you again for coming and explaining this to us.
My pleasure.
Thank you guys for watching, and we will be sharing links on the HAZIS and the GEM models. Thank you so much. Bye.